They tore through my garden like it was nothing, just dirt, just another patch of land on a map. And when I asked why, the guy in the hard hat barely looked up, just handed me a permit and said, "City approved it." That was the moment I realized something. I wasn't going to win this by arguing. So I didn't. I just paid attention. I live at the bottom of a slow, sloping neighborhood outside a small town called Ridgeway, the kind of place where nothing really happens unless it rains too hard or someone forgets to bring in their trash bins. My place sits right where the hill flattens out, and every time a storm rolls through, water comes slipping down from the streets above like it's following a path it's known forever. When I bought the house, the backyard was, honestly, kind of sad. Just hard-packed soil, a few stubborn weeds, and patches of dry earth that cracked open in the summer heat. Nothing grew there unless it fought for it. But I had time. Not a lot of money. Not much of a plan either. Just time, and the kind of stubborn patience you don't notice until you've spent years doing something slow. I started small. A couple of raised beds I built out of scrap wood, then I edged them with stones I hauled in myself, one bucket at a time. I remember my neighbor, Carl, leaning over the fence one afternoon, watching me sweat through my shirt and just shaking his head. "You know Home Depot sells this stuff already done, right?" he said. "Yeah," I told him, "but then it wouldn't be mine." He laughed, but after a while, he started bringing me coffee in the mornings. I think he understood. Over the years, the garden grew the way good things usually do, quietly, unevenly, but with intention. Tomatoes that took a season to figure themselves out. Herbs along the back fence that came back stronger every year. A couple of fruit trees that didn't do much at first, then suddenly one spring decided they were ready to belong there. I ran a thin irrigation line through the beds, nothing fancy, just enough to keep things alive through the dry months. And somewhere along the way, without really noticing when it happened, that backyard stopped being a project. It became the center of everything. It was where I drank my coffee in the mornings, where I stood when I needed to think, where the noise of everything else just kind of faded out. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The morning they showed up, I thought it was a mistake. I walked outside with my coffee, same as always, and just stopped. Half the garden was gone. There was a trench cut straight through the middle, deep and jagged, like someone had taken a knife to it. Piles of fresh dirt sat where my tomato beds used to be, and a crew of guys in reflective vests were lowering this massive plastic pipe into the ground like they'd done it 100 times before. For a second, I just stood there, trying to make sense of it. Then I walked over. "Hey," I said, louder than I meant to. "I think you've got the wrong house." One of the guys looked up, then pointed me toward the foreman, a thick-set man with a clipboard and that kind of tired expression that says he's not in the mood for complications. "You the homeowner?" he asked. "Yeah, and this isn't right." He flipped through a stack of papers like he'd already had this conversation in his head before I even opened my mouth, then turned the clipboard toward me. "City drainage project," he said. "All approved. We've got access through your property." I scanned the paperwork, my eyes catching words before my brain could really process them. Easement, stormwater, municipal authorization. It was all there. Legit. And that was the worst part. Turns out, the street above mine had been dealing with flooding during heavy rains, nothing dramatic, but enough that the city decided to fix it before it turned into something bigger. So the engineers came up with a plan. Run a drainage pipe downhill, cut through a few backyards, connect everything to the creek at the bottom. Efficient. On paper. And somewhere along that line, my yard became part of the solution. "There's a utility easement along the back edge of your property," the foreman said. Tapping the page like that settled everything. "We're allowed to install the pipe there." I followed his finger. He was right. There was a narrow strip marked out along the back fence, a few feet wide, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The problem was, that's not where they were digging. I pointed behind him, toward the trench slicing right through the center of my garden. "That's not the easement." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, this was where it would stop. Where someone would say, "Yeah, you're right, we'll fix it." Instead, he shrugged. "Ground's too rocky back there," he said. "Would take twice as long. This way's faster." I stared at him. "You can't just move it because it's easier." He gave me this look. Not angry, not even defensive, just tired. "Look," he said, lowering his voice like he was doing me a favor. "The pipe still ends up where it needs to go. Same result. We're saving time, that's all." "Yeah," I said slowly. "But you're not saving my garden." That got a small smile out of him, like I'd just said something mildly inconvenient, but not important. "We'll fill it back in," he said. "You won't even notice once it settles." That was the moment I understood exactly what kind of situation I was in. To them, this wasn't personal. It wasn't even a problem. It was just easier, and I was just in the way. They finished the job by the end of the day. I stood there for most of it, not saying much, just watching, the way the pipe disappeared into the ground, the way the soil got pushed back over it, uneven and loose, the way they stepped over what used to be my irrigation line like it didn't exist. By the time they packed up, the yard looked like a construction site someone had walked away from halfway through. The beds were gone, the herbs were buried, and the place that had taken me years to build had been undone in a few hours. Carl came by that evening, leaned on the fence, took one look, and just let out a low whistle. "Damn," he said. "You gonna fight this?" I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the ground, at the way the soil sat differently now, softer, disturbed, like it hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. "I don't know," I said finally. But that wasn't true. I didn't know. I just wasn't going to do it the way they expected. A week later, the city inspector signed off on the project. Clean. Approved. Done. That should have been the end of it. But something about it didn't sit right with me. Not just the damage, not just the shortcut, something deeper, something structural. So I went back to the paperwork. Sat down at my kitchen table one night, spread everything out, and actually read it. Line by line this time. Not like before when I was just trying to catch up to what was happening. And that's when I saw it. Not a mistake. Not exactly. But a gap. A difference between what was supposed to happen and what actually did. That gap I found in the paperwork. It wasn't obvious at first. Not the kind of thing that jumps out and screams mistake. It just sat there quietly between the lines, like something everyone else had decided not to look too closely at. The approved plans were detailed, almost annoyingly so. Diagrams, cross-sections, notes about soil density, compaction levels, drainage gradients. It wasn't just about putting a pipe in the ground. It was about how that pipe sat in the ground, what supported it, how water would move through it under pressure. And the more I read, the more one thing became clear. That system only worked if you followed the plan exactly. No shortcuts. No, this way's faster. Because the original route, the one along the easement behind my fence, that ground was rocky for a reason. It was stable, solid. It didn't shift when it got wet. My garden, that was the opposite. Loose soil, constantly turned, enriched, watered, perfect for growing things, terrible for holding structure under stress. And they had laid that pipe right through it. Skipping the compacted gravel base, skipping proper layering, basically trusting soft earth to behave like stone. I leaned back in my chair that night, staring at the drawings, and for the first time since they showed up, I didn't feel angry. I felt certain. The next morning, Carl caught me outside again, pacing along the edge of what used to be my tomato beds. "You look like you're planning something," he said, sipping his coffee. "I think they built it wrong," I told him. He raised an eyebrow. "Wrong like annoying wrong, or wrong like expensive wrong?" I glanced at the trench line, now covered but still visible if you knew where to look. "Expensive," I said. Carl let out a low chuckle. "Well, that's a different kind of problem." "Not mine," I replied. And for the first time since all of this started, I smiled. I didn't call a lawyer, didn't threaten anyone, didn't even go back to the foreman. I just filed a formal complaint with the city's engineering department. Calm, simple, documented. I included photos, the trench location, the deviation from the easement, the disturbed soil. And most importantly, I referenced their own plans, line numbers, specifications, the parts they were supposed to follow, and didn't. Then I waited. Nothing happened for a few days, which, honestly, didn't surprise me. Cities move slow unless something forces them not to. But the thing about drainage systems is they don't wait. They get tested, sooner or later. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. The kind of storm that builds all day, thick clouds, heavy air, that quiet tension before the sky finally gives in. By the time the rain started, it came down hard. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching it hit the yard, watching the water begin its usual path downhill. Only this time, something was different. It wasn't moving the way it used to. It was hesitating, pooling, right along the line where they buried the pipe. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. Rain soaked through it almost immediately, But I didn't care. I was watching the ground now, really watching it. The soil above the pipe had already started to sink in places, not dramatically, just enough to create slight dips, low points where water gathered instead of flowing through. And then I saw it. A ripple. Subtle but wrong. Like the water underneath wasn't moving freely, like something was slowing it down. About 20 minutes later, a city truck pulled up. 2 inspectors stepped out, hoods up, clipboards in hand. One of them glanced at me standing in the rain and gave a small nod. "You the one who filed the complaint?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "You might want to see this." I led them along the trench line, pointing out the uneven settling, the pooling water, the spots where the ground felt softer underfoot. They didn't say much at first, just watched, measured, compared what they were seeing to the documents they brought with them. And then, the system started to fail. It didn't happen all at once. No dramatic explosion or anything like that. Just pressure. The kind you don't notice until it has nowhere left to go. The water coming down from the street above kept feeding into the pipe, but inside, where the ground had shifted unevenly, the pipe wasn't sitting level anymore. There was a low point, a sag, and that sag slowed everything down, then backed it up. Then, "You see that?" one of the inspectors said suddenly, stepping closer to a section near the middle of the yard. The ground there had darkened, saturated. And then, right in front of us, muddy water started pushing up through the soil. Not a lot at first. Just enough to tell you something underneath wasn't working the way it was supposed to. But it didn't stop. Within minutes, the pressure built, and suddenly the system that was supposed to carry water away was doing the opposite. It was sending it back, up the line, toward the street. The second inspector cursed under his breath, flipping through the plans. "This isn't right," he said. "The grade's off. It shouldn't be pooling here." "It's not just the grade," I said quietly. They both looked at me. I pointed toward the back fence, toward the rocky strip they were supposed to use. "They didn't install it there." The first inspector frowned. "What do you mean?" "They moved it," I said. "Said it was easier." There was a pause. The kind where everything clicks into place a little too quickly. The second inspector looked back at the yard, then at the plans, then back at the yard again. "Show me," he said. I walked them along the edge of the property, explaining what happened, where the original easement was, how far off the trench line had been, what the foreman told me. They didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just listened. And when I finished, the first inspector let out a slow breath. "Well," he said, "that would do it." By the time the rain started to ease up, the situation had gone from questionable to undeniable. Water had backed up far enough that it was beginning to collect along the curb up the street. Exactly the problem this whole project was supposed to solve. Only now it was worse. Because the system wasn't just failing. It was failing wrong. The inspectors made a few calls from their truck, voices low, clipped, professional. I didn't hear everything, but I caught enough. Non-compliant installation. Deviation from approved route. Improper base support. Each phrase landed like a quiet verdict. Before they left, one of them walked back over to me. "You did the right thing filing that complaint," he said. "If this had gone unnoticed." He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. I just nodded. "When will they fix it?" I asked. He gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Oh," he said, "they're not fixing it." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "They're removing it," he replied. "All of it." That night, for the first time since my garden had been torn apart, I slept well. Not because anything had been restored yet, not because the damage was undone, but because I knew something now, something the foreman probably hadn't considered when he chose the easier path. Shortcuts don't just save time. Sometimes, they build the exact conditions for things to fall apart. The next morning, I heard the trucks before I saw them, and this time, they weren't there to install anything. The trucks rolled in earlier than the first time, like they were hoping to get ahead of something. Maybe the heat, maybe the attention, maybe the fact that this time, they weren't showing up as the guys building a solution. They were the guys coming back to undo one. I was already outside when they arrived, coffee in hand, standing in the same spot where I'd first seen the trench cut through my garden. Except now, I knew exactly what I was looking at. And more importantly, so did they. The foreman stepped out of his truck, same clipboard, same boots, but something about him had changed, not dramatically, just a little tighter around the eyes, a little less certain in the way he carried himself. He saw me, hesitated for half a second, then walked over. "Well," he said, exhaling like he'd been holding that breath all morning. Guess you got what you wanted. I took a sip of coffee, let that sit for a moment. No, I said calmly. I just pointed out what you didn't follow. He gave a short laugh, not amused, more like someone acknowledging a move in a game they didn't realize they were playing. Yeah, he said, glancing back at the yard. Well, now we all get to pay for it. There it was. That shift. Not responsibility, not really. Just inconvenience. I tilted my head slightly. He didn't answer that. Just turned, barked a few orders to the crew, and within minutes, the sound of machinery filled the yard again. Only this time, it felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. Like every scoop of dirt came with a price tag attached. They started digging along the same line they'd used before, tearing back through the soil they'd already disturbed, exposing the pipe that had barely had time to settle into place before it failed. I watched as the plastic sections came up, one by one, coated in wet earth, and even without being an engineer, you could see it. The sag, the slight bend where it shouldn't have been, the uneven support underneath. It wasn't dramatic, but it didn't have to be. Failure rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it just shows up when it's tested. Carl wandered over mid-morning, hands in his jacket pockets, watching the whole thing unfold like it was better than anything on TV. I gotta admit, he said, leaning on the fence, this is satisfying. I smirked a little. Yeah, in a slow, expensive kind of way. He nodded toward the crew. You think they knew? I followed his gaze. The foreman was standing off to the side now, talking on the phone, pacing slightly, not as relaxed as before. Yeah, I said after a moment. I think they knew it wasn't right. Then why do it? I shrugged. Because it was easier. Carl let that sit for a second, then chuckled under his breath. Funny how that works out. By the afternoon, the trench through my garden was completely open again. Only now, instead of installing something, they were removing every trace of what they'd done. And once the pipe was gone, they didn't start over in the same place. They moved. All the way to the back of the property. Right where the easement had always been. Right where the ground turned hard and rocky and difficult to work with. I walked over as they began marking the new line, boots crunching against soil that hadn't been touched in years. The foreman noticed me again. This is what you wanted, right? He said, gesturing to the rocky strip. I shook my head slightly. This is what the plan said, I replied. There was a difference. And for the first time, he didn't argue it. Digging through that section took longer. A lot longer. The machines struggled more. The crew had to stop and adjust, bring in different tools, break through layers they'd avoided the first time around. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't fast. It was correct. And you could feel the cost of that decision in every extra hour, every delayed movement, every quiet conversation between workers who knew exactly why they were there again. Not because the job was hard, but because someone had tried to make it easy. Over the next few days, the new installation took shape, this time following the plans down to the smallest detail. Gravel base carefully laid, soil compacted in layers, measurements checked, rechecked, no shortcuts, no improvising. And slowly, things started to look the way they were always supposed to. But what surprised me most wasn't the pipe. It was what came after. One morning, a smaller crew showed up, different truck, different equipment, and behind them, a man I hadn't seen before, dressed a little cleaner than the rest, holding a folder instead of a shovel. He introduced himself as part of the contractor's restoration team. We're here to repair the affected areas of your property, he said, polite, measured, like he'd had this conversation before. I glanced at the yard, at what was left of it. Repair, I repeated. He nodded. Restore it to pre-construction condition. I let out a small breath, looking past him at the bare patches where my garden used to be. It's not just dirt, I said. I know, he replied. We'll do our best. And to their credit, they did. They brought in fresh soil, not the cheap kind. Either dark, rich, the kind you can tell has life in it just by looking. They rebuilt the raised beds, carefully this time. Even asked me about the layout, the spacing, where things had been before. At one point, one of the workers held up a bundle of irrigation tubing. This yours? He asked. I nodded. He looked at it, then back at me. We can reinstall it, or replace it if you want. I hesitated, then said, replace it. He gave a small smile. Yeah, I would too. Carl got a kick out of that part. Man, he said one afternoon, watching them work, They're basically landscaping for you now. Yeah, I said, just took destroying it first. He laughed. Still not a bad deal. I didn't answer right away, because the truth was, it wasn't about the deal. It was about the principle. By the end of the week, the garden was not exactly the same, but close. Close enough that if you hadn't seen what happened, you might not notice. The herbs were replanted along the fence. The beds stood where they used to. The soil, freshly turned, waited for something to grow again. And along the back edge of the property, the pipe ran quietly, buried deep beneath solid ground, exactly where it had been designed to go. The foreman stopped by one last time before they cleared out. No clipboard this time. No paperwork. Just him. He stood there for a moment, looking at the yard, then at me. "Looks good," he said. I nodded. "It does." There was a pause. Then he shifted his weight slightly, like he was deciding whether or not to say something. "Could have been avoided," he muttered. I met his gaze. "Yeah," I said. "It could have." Another pause. Then he gave a small nod. Not quite an apology, not quite an admission, but something close enough to matter. And then he left. A few weeks later, the first signs of life started to come back. Small at first, green shoots pushing through the soil, herbs taking hold again, the garden slowly remembering what it was supposed to be. And I found myself out there one morning, coffee in hand, same as always, except now, there was something different in the air. Not just quiet, something steadier. Here's the thing, though. I didn't fight them. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't try to stop the work while it was happening. I let them do exactly what they thought was easier. And then I let reality catch up with it. But every time I tell this story, someone always asks the same question. Why didn't you just confront them harder from the start? And I get it. Because part of me wanted to. Standing there, watching years of work get torn apart, it would have felt good to push back, to escalate, to make it a fight right then and there. But if I had, they probably would have dug in, defended it, made it a battle of opinions. Instead, I made it about facts, about their own plans, about a system that either worked or didn't. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in that situation, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have stopped them immediately, even if it meant a bigger conflict? Or would you have done what I did, step back, document everything, and let the consequences play out? Because depending on who you ask, this story either ends with quiet justice, or with me letting it go too far before stepping in. Drop your take in the comments. I read more of them than I probably should. And if you've ever dealt with something like this, neighbors, contractors, the city making decisions over your space, I'd honestly like to hear how it turned out. Sometimes the right move isn't the loudest one, but that doesn't mean it's obvious.